Please, God, just come down here and make Anthony give Jimmy Dibs a 10. It's supposed to have a 10, God.
Bert the Gastano here, the internet's busiest music nerd. And it's time for a review of the new Liturgy album. The artwork. Liturgy is a reasonably polarizing New York rock band that has turned heads and churned stomachs with their pretty standout blend of math rock, experimental rock, and black metal. And even though their sound has rubbed some people the wrong way, I think it's really been the philosophy behind the music on Liturgy's records that may have really turned some people off. A philosophy espoused by the band's frontman, Hunter "Hunt" Hendricks, sort of labeling the style of music that Liturgy plays as transcendental black metal. With the band's last full-length LP, Aesthetica, a lot of people caught wind of a little manifesto and some lectures that Hunter had been doing talking about this new style of black metal, and maybe not intentionally, but the language he was using and the tone he was taking certainly made it sound like he was taking this new style he was creating and portraying the older sort of roots of black metal as kind of inferior in a way. Regardless, I still do love Aesthetica, definitely one of my favorite rock records of 2011, and definitely transcendental black metal's joyous inception, in my opinion. Or maybe if not its inception, its high watermark, definitely the best album in this incredibly micro genre. And in a way, when listening to this record, I kind of find a bit of truth in what Hunter is saying, at least in how this new style of black metal compares to the old school. For example, the burst beat in transcendental black metal brought to life by drummer extraordinaire Greg Fox on this record, which is incredibly fluid, cacophonous, really exhilarating style of drumming, and something I don't think Liturgy would have been able to continue without had not Greg hopped onto this new record as well, because it seemed like there was a point between this album and Liturgy's last where Greg was going to no longer be with the band. And the other things of transcendental black metal, like it being solar versus old school black metal being lunar, as well as other things like courage and hypertrophy and affirmation. All of these things have added up into what I think is a very bright, triumphant, and grand approach to black metal music. And chances are there are a lot of other artists who might put as much philosophical thought into the approach they want to take with their music. The issue, though, with Hunter is that he sorta kinda showed us how the sausage was made. Most people don't give a shit, and a great deal of those who will actually hear out what you're saying will only be happy to misinterpret your words and try to use them against you. Especially when it comes to a culture, a musical culture, as insular and as traditionalist as black metal. Now personally, while I have seen a few recently posted charts on Hunter's Instagram that might kind of illustrate where exactly he is going, I don't 100% know where his philosophical ideals lie on this new record over here. But I do get a slight sense that this time around, Hunter is not just philosophically thinking about how his music works, but maybe even creating music for this fantasy world that he's created entirely in his head. Not only does the music on this new record here have a really strong sense of place, really like it is coming from somewhere else, but it also feels like Hunter is trying to make a magnum opus out of the musical ideas he forged on Aesthetica. He's bringing over those bright guitar tones, those burst beats, some of those clean chanting vocals. There are no screams or wretched vocals on this record, surprisingly. Yeah. Get used to that vocal inflection. You will hear quite a bit of it on this record. The guitars are strummed and tremolo picked very speedily, and every once in a while I will get, a bit of deja vu from the last few Liturgy records. So in a lot of ways, this does feel like a Liturgy album. It doesn't feel like Hunter has, sort of gone completely left field and totally lost touch with the sound that we know comes from this band thus far. But I think he's added a bit of like symphonic metal into the equation here with a ton of chimes or bells, which may in fact just be MIDI, and then we have MIDI horns and maybe some real string sections on this record too that sound absolutely gorgeous, especially on the track Quetzalcoatl. It's rock music with some really emotive and sad melodies, but there's kind of this really obviously fake digital aesthetic to it as well that I think is 100% intentional. And though it doesn't always go over sounding fantastic, it doesn't necessarily completely stop Hunter from coming together with some compelling moments like the digital horns all over the start of the song Fanfare, which are very bright, very triumphant. I think a great start to the album. This track sounds like the opening music to a really epic battle at the Roman Colosseum. And given the roaring, screaming crowd of people at the very end of the second track here that leads out of that intro song, I think that's exactly the feel that Hunter was going for. Having this music not only feel ancient in a sense, but also being performed to this ancient or medieval crowd of people. The sounds of all the instruments actually bleed into one another a little bit, as if you are listening to a live recording. However, my issue with this song is that the mix is absolutely god-awful at points. The chimes all over this track, not only do they not totally sync up with the way the instrumentation is sounding, like they're kind of sloppily played, but they just jut out of the mix in such just like a sharp, just like a pinprick kind of way. It actually makes the music a little difficult to listen to without getting like some serious ear fatigue. There were moments where I was like bordering on having a headache. And these chimes repeatedly pop up throughout the record and sound just as sloppy. At some points they sound better than others. It sounds like Hunter sort of brings some chimes or some bells with a lower pitch, and those sound much better. But once he starts bringing in that it really sort of ruins the vibe of the track a little bit. Though I don't think their inclusion was an awful idea in concept. I just think they could have been played better and they could have been mixed better. That's all. Other than that, it was a fantastic idea. There were a lot of moments on this record where I'm not so much moved or excited by what I'm actually hearing, but I'm kind of intrigued and I'm thinking, yeah, I could see what you're going for there. To add to a lot of the interesting sounds on this track, we have some of the crowd noises and these chimes too, kind of getting glitched out and stretched and just manipulated and thrown into the mix for some added noise and character. Again, really, it feels like Hunter is trying to take some old world musical modes and ideas and sounds and bring them into the digital age. You know, it feels like, in a way, I'm at the Colosseum listening to this really strange metal music performance, but it's all happening in a computer. Now this track Follow actually glides into one of my favorite tracks on the LP, Calvo Howl, which features guitars, these marching snare drums, and more MIDI horns. And this track actually portrays Liturgy's very unique approach to groove. Not a lot of bands approach groove in the way that Liturgy approaches groove. And, you know, you're essentially getting these syncopated snares, guitars, and horns. Constantly building, escalating, getting more intense, and it never really sinks into just sort of something you could nod your head to. It's just always off kilter, it's just always off beat. The band actually strings this track out for like 7 minutes, which may seem like a little excessive for this one single musical idea, but if you do remember on Liturgy's last record, they sort of experimented with the idea of repetition as well, taking riffs and kind of repeating the groove over and over and over and over to create kind of a hypnotic feel. And I think that's what they're going for this album as well. Something that is simultaneously visceral and hard-hitting and just mind-numbingly hypnotic too. Sometimes they actually edit the riff so that there's like a really weird glitchy skip. And it feels like there's some pump organ or like some bagpipe that's also starting to play in the background and really thicken up the mix. For me, this is an example of how the organic instrumentation and the digital and the MIDI instrumentation on this record can come together in a really great, grand, epic way. Not necessarily overly noisy or kind of deflated or flaccid in the way that you have those high-pitched chimes kind of overtaking the guitars and sounding incredibly homely. And now that I kind of see the full vision of this album, tracks like Quetzalcoatl, which was a lead song bringing fans into this album, I really get that track so much more. We have driving synthetic kick drums on this track, fluttering guitar leads, some really weird chanting. The tone of this track will not be for everyone. It sort of borders on industrial metal in a way. But how Liturgy layers these fluttering guitars and combines them with like these movie soundtrack quality string sections is pretty amazing, and I think goes to show just how underrated their approach to composition and chord progressions are. I mean, there are a few bands that I think, again, approach groove and approach chord progressions in the way that Liturgy does. The end result isn't always amazing, but the end of this Quetzalcoatl track, what it really builds up to, for me was pretty breathtaking. And then we have tracks like HAELEGEN on here, which is a bit of an interlude song, and for me the interlude tracks on this record actually are much better than the interlude moments on Aesthetica. This is a really chilly, somber keyboard piece that sounds like the intro music to a really epic RPG on a Super Nintendo. And I love the way this track actually glides into the next song, Rain Away, which is 11 minutes, longest song on the entire LP. The chimes see a slight return, though they don't overtake the whole track in the way that they do on Follow. And the immense layers of guitar on this track. My buddy Austin, who occasionally writes for the site, actually compared Liturgy's very maximal guitar layering on this record to that of like a Glenn Branca project, and I have to kind of agree. And with even more strings as well as horns and a plethora of other sounds, Hunter actually creates a more beautiful and I think triumphant crescendo than he did on Quetzalcoatl just a few minutes ago. This track is my favorite on the entire LP, and it feels like the close to a really amazing live performance. I mean, this entire record, for the most part, you know, despite its obvious flaws and its rough patches, feels like it was just an exhilarating musical stage show, experimental ancient metal style. This track feels so final. It feels just but the problem is the artwork keeps going with a few tracks that, while I don't totally hate them, I feel like they're a little tacked on and don't necessarily play into the aesthetic of the record up until this point. For one, the song Vitrio, which has a kind of different vibe, these very heavy, distorted sub-bass hits happening very prominently throughout the song. And Hunter, in a way, we have him kind of rapping on this track. There's a bit of flow to the way that he is sort of delivering this deadpan spoken word with some incredibly sinister and morbid lyrics. And of course, there's some background chanting happening on this track too, and some very just dark, dreary synthesizers. I actually wouldn't mind this sonic direction if Hunter were to turn it into a solo project or something like that, or maybe even work it into a future Liturgy album a little bit more fluidly or cohesively. I turn your ashes into gold. But the song kind of meets an abrupt end, and so does Total War, which feels really like a cliffhanger. And maybe that was kind of intentional, because in a lot of ways I think Hunter sees his music as a continual thing. I don't think he sees any of his pieces necessarily as separate art objects. I think with each album he sees himself in this linear progression. Still, I do like the melody on this track, and I think more than most songs here, there's a serious fluidity to how the instrumentation moves on this track, despite there being some electronic drums on this song. The way the guitars and the percussion moves on this track is so slow and I think graceful and very much together. All in all, I did enjoy this record. I think it's a good album, and I think it's incredibly intriguing. And for people who might sort of get down on rock music as not being creative right now, or not having new ideas, or not taking any risks, this is really the record to point them to. You know, if you want to hear something different going on in rock music, bands like Liturgy are at that cutting edge and are trying new things, even if it turns a lot of people off, turns a lot of people away, and doesn't necessarily resonate with everyone. And if it doesn't resonate with you, if you don't like this record, I could certainly understand why. You know, I think the way the digital and organic instrumentation comes together on this record isn't always good a lot of the time. Sometimes it creates a kind of ugly aesthetic. But that combination of the ancient, the medieval world, and the new and digital world seems like a very conscious fusion on this album. I just think it's not always a harmonious fusion, I guess. I don't think the concept is bad, it's just the execution occasionally is just okay. I'm feeling a decent to strong 7 on this album, though I could definitely see this album getting at least an honorable mention at the end of the year on my year-end list. There are some people who have kind of disregarded this record as trash and maybe even as trolling. I think, that's maybe a little too cynical, in my opinion. I think Liturgy is doing some interesting things here. And, it's not always easy on the ears, and it's not always pretty, and it doesn't always fit snugly into, oh, is this rock music? Is it electronic music? Is it metal music? Is it even from this century? Hunter and company on this record are bringing together so many things sonically and historically that there's naturally going to be some cognitive dissonance. People are going to hear the combination of things on this record and maybe even wince at first listen thinking, that doesn't go together, that does not work. I had to listen to this record again and again to sort of acclimate myself and move past that. But even once I got beyond that wall, I thought there were some, glaring technical flaws and again, maybe a little deja vu that kept me from really being head over heels for this album. Though again, still, check it out. Some interesting things going on here. You're probably not going to hear another rock record like this year. Yes, that was a lot of talking. Again, decent to strong 7 on this thing. Transition! If you've given this album a listen, what did you think of it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Why? What do you think I should review next? And that's it. Anthony Fantano, Liturgy, the artwork, forever.